Hi there folks, in today's demonstration I'm going to show you how we can build a Power Automate flow that will generate random passwords. So this is a rather efficient flow, 4 actions in total. We'll build it step by step, no apply to eaches, and we'll be able to generate a password based on letters, numbers and symbols. Then I'll jump into a slightly more complex demonstration where I built a flow that will allow you to parameterize the number of letters, the number of symbols and the number of numbers, but also make those things optional. So if that's something that interests you, please make sure you watch on. Don't forget to like and subscribe. And without further ado, let's jump into the demonstration. So here I am in Power Automate, and I've started with a compose action that contains every single letter, number and symbol that I could possibly think of. And you'll note that I have both the lowercase and the uppercase letters represented in this string. Now I mentioned there are going to be 4 actions in this solution. This is action number 1, and then what we're going to do next is we're going to use a compose action. So with this compose action we're going to be able to split up this string into an array, and so I'll give this a new name. We'll call it compose array, and then in the expression builder I'm going to use the expression chunk, which allows us to break a string up into an array based on the length of the chunk. So if I go back into my dynamic tab here, I can select the original output from the compose, and then if I insert a comma, I can insert the number 1, and then that will now create an array of all those individual letters based on that length of 1. So I'll go ahead and hit OK, and we'll go and save and test that to see what the output is. So looking at the output of this compose array, you can now see that I have all those individual letters, symbols and numbers in an array, and this will allow us then to select at random how many letters or numbers we require from this new array that we've created. So if we jump back into editing the flow and add in my favorite action, the select action, we're then going to use an expression known as range. And what range will do is it will create an array based on a starting number and a length. And our length I've set at 8, so that basically means that it will end up with a password of length 8. If you wanted a password of length 12, of course you put in the number 12, and if you wanted to make that dynamic, then you could replace that number with an expression. So if I go ahead and hit OK, and ultimately if I wanted to select each of those numbers as we loop through this select, I could use the expression item open close brackets, but actually all I'm doing at this point is using that array to make sure that my select loops 8 times. Now remember, the purpose of this is to go and select a random letter or number or symbol from our compose array that we have above here, and we can do that by switching our select into text mode. So with it set in text mode, we're then able to select the compose array that you see here. But if I go ahead and select that, it'll actually insert the pill. I want to make a change to this expression so that it's randomly selecting one of the letters or symbols or numbers from that array. So if I remove that, jump into my expression tab, hit the space, jump back into dynamic content, I can choose the compose array expression here, and then jump back into my expression tab. Now if you're not familiar with this, with arrays you can select each of the values using an integer, i.e. a number. And if I was to put a question mark and the number 3, we know that integers start from 0, and so this would select the 4th character or the 4th value from our array. And because this range is looping 8 times, it would mean that we'd select the 4th value from our array 8 times. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to hit OK, and we'll save and test it so we can check what the output is. So looking at the output of the select, you can see that we've selected the lowercase d, which of course is our 4th letter in our array. And you'll see the input is based on those numbers 0 all the way through to 7 because we have 8 instances. Now of course we need to make this letter D random. We don't want it to be fixed. So how are we going to go ahead and make that change? Well, if we jump back into edit and into our expression here, we simply need to make this number 3 random. And the way we're going to do that is to use an expression rand. So random will take a starting point, which is going to be 0, because our integer index starts from 0. We're going to put a comma in, and then in terms of how many numbers we want to be randomizing on, it's based on the length of that compose array. So there is a length expression that I can add in here with the open and close brackets, and the length is based on our compose array. So if I jump back onto the dynamic content, I can select the compose array, and we'll see now that in the opening and closing brackets for a length, I have the outputs of the compose array. Now if I hit update, that's all there is to it. We're now going to be selecting letters from this compose array at random using this select. And the final stage, of course, is to bring back together all of those random letters and numbers and symbols into a string. So that's what brings in our fourth action, which is again a compose. And then with compose, we're going to use the expression join. If I go into dynamic content, I can insert that select, put in a comma and single quotes, and that will join together all of those random values into a single string. So we'll go ahead and quickly test. And if we look at the output of the compose 2, you can see now we have a random string. If we look at that select, we can see that the letters and numbers and symbols have been selected at random. And if I was to go ahead and test that once more and look at the compose 2, we can see we have an entirely different string this time around. So jumping back into edit, if I was to go into this compose here, I can specify exactly what letters, what numbers, what symbols I want to appear in my passwords. And if I was to type in, for instance, demobird365 and go and let's go and change the range as well. So at the moment we're generating an 8-letter password. Let's make it a 12 and update that. If I test it, I should now get a completely randomized string based on the letters that are in demobird365. So if we look at that compose 2, you can see now we have a completely random string using the letters that were available from demobird365. So in the next part of my demonstration, I'm going to show you how to generate passwords based on parameters. So if you want to specify exactly how many letters, how many numbers and how many symbols are to appear in your passwords, then you can do that using the following solution. And potentially, if you need to generate multiple passwords in one flow, then we can look at how to do that also. Now, this particular solution doesn't use an apply to each, so it's relatively lean and mean, runs efficiently. You don't have to worry really about the number of API calls. And I have, like I say, 2 examples in order to generate these passwords based on your specific requirements. You'll notice on screen that I have an array in a compose, and that has 4 values. The first of which is all the letters, both lowercase and uppercase. The second is the numbers, the third is the symbols, and then the fourth is an odd looking string which is a combination of zeros, ones and twos. Using the fact that we can select values within an array based on an integer, I have 5 zeros, which means we'll be able to pick 5 letters. I have 3 ones, which means we'll be able to pick 3 numbers, and I have 3 twos, which means I'll be able to pick 3 symbols. And this is a relatively straightforward way of specifying how many letters, numbers and symbols are to appear in your password. The second version of this flow allows you to be slightly more dynamic. The only other thing that I'd like to make you aware of at this point in time is if you are including symbols in an array and you have the / or double quotes, you need to ensure that you escape those with a /. Otherwise, Power Automate will treat this as a string rather than an array. So if we jump into our select, we're going to use chunk, which we've already seen, but rather than chunking a string, we need to select that specific string, and we do that by using the integer index, which we can see here as number 3. So based on this compose action, we start with integer 0, 1, 2, 3. What we're doing is we are chunking this string here, 0, 0, 0, 1, 1, 2, 2, 2. So we'll get an array of all those numbers, and that will allow us then to use that dynamically within our map. So if you remember previously, we had a range at the top of our select, and that allowed us to generate the number of iterances. But on this occasion, we're specifying exactly how many numbers, letters, and symbols are to appear in our password by using that string. So you'll notice also this time round, rather than using text mode, I have a map. And I have a random character, but also a random position. And I'm going to use that random position to allow us to sort the random characters based on the random position that's generated. So if we look at random position first off, it's literally a number between 0 and 1000. And I thought if we generate that at random, we can then sort on that random position, which means we're not going to get the letters, the numbers and symbols in that strict order, i.e. we're not going to get 5 letters, 3 numbers and 3 symbols in that specific order. Looking at the next expression, it's chunk, and it's chunk with a bit more complexity. We have the output of the compose, and we have in square brackets here an integer based on item. So if you remember here, we're chunking. The from is a chunk which creates an array of these zeros, these ones and twos. So in each loop, we're going to be getting a 0, a 0, a 0, a 0, a 0, and then a 1, a 1, a 1, a 2, a 2, a 2, and that will allow us to select from each of these values within an array. So when it's a 0, it's going to select this string. When it's a 1, it's going to select this string, and when it's a 2, it's going to select this string. And that's what enables us to get the initial string from that array. Then of course we're chunking it based on a 1, and then we simply need to pick a random number from 0 to the length of that string. And so these are things that we've already seen in our first demonstration, albeit the expressions are slightly different. So with that in mind, we now need to select the random character key in order to create an array that does not have the random position. But you'll see that the from is using the sort expression. So I'm sorting here, I'm sorting this select from above based on the rand position, and with it sorted, I can then use the map in text mode to select the random character, which is equal to item, open close brackets, question mark, square brackets, and rand char, which of course is based on the key name that I have here. So this will return everything back into an array. It will remove the random position, but we're sorting based on that random position so that we're no longer retrieving the letters, the numbers, and the symbols in that strict order. And then very much like before, if I open up that compose, we're simply using that join expression to join those selected letters. Now if I go ahead and test this, we can have a look at the output of the password, and we have a randomized password, and that password contains 5 letters, 3 numbers, and 3 symbols. Now if we jump further up the flow and have a look at the history, if we look at that select, when we spoke about the chunk and chunking the string that's in our compose, so that 000112222, you can see we have 5 zeros, we have the 3 ones, and we have the 3 twos. And remember, we use those integer values in order to select our, if I expand the output here, the letters, the numbers, and the symbols. And because we're generating those random positions using that rand expression, we can then sort them in our next select and just return back those letters in our array. Now I did also mention that I have a second solution, and if we have a look at that, which is contained within a scope, we'll have a look at the history first. You can see that I can specify the number of letters, the number of numbers, and the number of symbols. And if at any point you don't want any of these, you can specify the number 0, and of course it won't return the number, symbols, or letters based on the number 0. So you can be very specific. You can have a dynamic input, you could have a trigger, you could pass a requirement from your Power App or from a Microsoft form, and then you could dynamically generate a password based on these parameters. So with these parameters, I then have 3 different selects which all do the same thing, very similar to the demo that we've just seen. It will pick the number of letters, creating a range from 0 to that length, and then inserting a random position. And we do that for the letters, we do that for the numbers, and we also do that for the symbols. The only difference now is because we've got 3 different arrays, we need to bring them together in a union. And with that union, we then have all of those letters, numbers, and symbols in one array. And there are 2 options. I thought maybe you might want to return those letters, numbers, and symbols in the strict order that they were selected. So if you wanted 7 letters, for instance, then you would get all 7 letters in that order, then the 3 numbers and the 2 symbols. Or you might want to select the random order, which is when we would use that sort on the random position so that they're in a completely different order. And finally, if I have a look at this composed passwords, you can see the two compared side by side. So they'll all have the same letters and numbers in them and symbols, but one is in that strict order. So we have the 7 letters at the beginning, but the other is in a random order. And it's just really demonstrating what you can do with the power of some of these expressions. So if I jump back into edit, we can go into that compose, we can see our compose requirements, which is an object, not an array. So make sure you have those squiggly brackets rather than the square brackets. And the keys need to be in double quotes, but the numbers, because they're not in double quotes, are treated like numbers rather than strings. If you do put double quotes around those numbers, you're going to have to use the int expression to convert them further on. The select letters, the select numbers and select symbols are very much the same. The only difference here is the range, as you can see, starts from 0, but the parameter is based on querying the letter count or the number count or the symbol count. And then when it comes to the chunk, slightly different. This time it's not dynamic. We are going to set the position of the letters, the numbers and the symbols. So we know that our letters are in position 0 within the outputs of that compose. If I jump back to my compose here, I know that my letters here are on position 0, integer index 0. So within the chunk, I specify 0. And again, when I go to the random, the length of the compose is based on position 0. If I go into the numbers just to compare it, if we have a look at that chunk, you can see that it's position 1, which of course is our numbers. And again, if we went to the end of that expression, all the way to the end, you'll see that rather than having the 0, I now have the 1. Previously, remember, we're using an expression to get that value from our chunk. Random position is exactly the same, 0 to 1000. And the select symbols is absolutely the same again, albeit this time it's a 2 because of course we're pulling that data from our third value within our compose. When it comes to creating the union, we actually need to nest these because a union can only take 2 inputs. So we're doing a union of the first 2, which you can see here in the expression, and then we're doing a final union involving the letters and the original union, and that gives us all 3 of these arrays, the letters, the numbers and symbols, as one big array. I then have 2 different options depending on whether or not you want those in strict order or in random order. You can see that if they're in strict order, all we're doing is taking the output from that compose union and then using that map to select the random characters. If we're looking for random order, then we're using that sort based on that rand position. And again, like the one above, we're just then retrieving the item of the random character. In terms of the output, again, very much the same. We're using join on either the select of the strict order or the select of the random order. And you'll notice that I have a little comment here. I thought you might potentially want your passwords to start with an upper letter. So despite anything else, any of the other parameters, you might always want your passwords to start with an uppercase letter. So you can do that by inserting this expression. So I'm going to do that just on this one example. I'll go into the expression tab, I'll paste it in, I'll hit OK, and you can see now I have that 2 upper expression at the front there alongside the join of the select strict order. And all it's doing is we're taking a chunk again of that string, which is based on integer index 0, and then we're choosing a random letter from 0 through to the length of that string. And that will allow us then to convert it to an uppercase, because of course that string includes both upper and lowercase, but we want to ensure that that letter is always an uppercase letter. This is purely just for demonstration. I just thought it would be quite interesting to highlight. And if I go ahead and test, I can jump right to the end here. We can have a look at the password that's been generated. Ironically, it would have begun with a capital case B anyway, but we've guaranteed that it begins with a random letter, in this case an uppercase B, which you can see is not included in the one below because we didn't include that additional expression. So I did also say that what if you wanted to generate multiple passwords, and how can we do this as efficient as possible? Well, there are 2 ways that I could think of. If you want to be dynamic with the number of passwords, i.e. you want to specify I want to generate 10 passwords, then you could use an apply to each, and you could use a range, so 0 to that parameter, and you could simply loop through this scope the number of times, apply to each, and generate the passwords a number of times. The other option, if you want to generate 5 passwords but as efficiently as possible, and it's always 5 passwords, then you could simply duplicate this rand character on each of those selects so that you have rand character 1, rand character 2, rand character 3, 4, and 5. And then with that, you can have 5 different expressions at the bottom to bring them together and then join them so that you have those passwords. So let's have a quick look at how I've achieved that with an apply to each, and then we'll wrap up the demo. You can see that I have a compose with the requirements that I've dragged outside of my scope, so it's now above my apply to each, and I've updated the letter count, number count, and symbol count, and I've also inserted a value for the number of passwords, so we're expecting to get 10 passwords back. I have an apply to each. Within that, I have a range, which is based on 0 through to the number of requirements, based on the number of passwords, so that value there, 10, which will be dynamic. And then I've dragged my scope to inside that apply to each. So it will loop 10 times on this occasion, generate 10 passwords. And the only additional step I've now done is I've put that expression for the join inside a single compose, so just underneath the one that I had before that included the text as an output. With that, because I've called it compose random password, outside of the apply to each, I can use outputs, compose random password, which is the name of my compose, and it will bring together all 10 of those results into an array. So it's a nice little trick if you're looking to do something quick without using a variable. If I go and put it into test, we're expecting 10 passwords, remember, and if I jump down to the bottom, I have in here 10 unique passwords. Each of them contains the number of letters, one symbol, and the number of numbers. So of course that marks the end of the demonstration. You've learned how to use some expressions like chunk and range, and join and rand, and of course ultimately how you can generate passwords in the most efficient way using very few actions. So I'd love to hear in the comments below how you've used this in your own solutions, what you've taken away, and if I haven't seen you before, make sure you like and subscribe, and let's see you again sometime soon. Thanks very much for watching. Cheers, bye.